John, it's so great to catch up with you again. We overlapped at Notre Dame a little bit, but unfortunately, due in part to COVID, we interacted much less than I would have liked to, but at least I get to talk to you again today.
Thanks so much, Nate. My favorite memory of you is when it comes to lunch. I remember you were a frequent when we would have visitors on campus, and when I visited, it was Nate was the lunch staple. So I always look forward if I was able to get on the sign up quick enough where we could spend some time at lunch together.
I found like my favorite burger at Legends. It was the whiskey barbecue bacon burger, and I think even my wife got into that burger. So yeah, I try not to be too selfish. I try to like always give people a little bit of time to sign up for lunch, but I did love going to lunch. Well, we're not eating lunch today. We're in our sterile, offices. But regardless, I'm happy to talk to you. And John, you've had a great career. I look at you and you look very young, but when I talk to you, you always seem very wise. And as you think back on your research, are there 2 to 3 simple, practical, underappreciated lessons you've learned you'd most like to pass along to others?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Nate, and thank you for the kind words. It's a nice redefinition of the word "great," so that's always nice, and we can help Merriam-Webster. So I think the first big lesson that I've learned in most of my more recent research, but especially earlier in my career as well, is that how we internalize external expectations of ourselves or what we think other people are expecting of us drives our behavior in ways that causes biases. And I think this is really cool because there's all sorts of research and we talk about individual biases all the time, but oftentimes it's kind of seen as like this internal struggle that we do, like sunk cost or escalation of commitment, where we just have to kind of get over our own heads in order to think rationally. But I'm not sure that's the case. I think it's when we expect or when we think somebody expects something of us, we react in a way to try to mirror those expectations. And oftentimes that's a way that's both disingenuous to ourselves, doesn't do ourselves any favors, and is irrational or goes off course from probably what would have been the best outcome anyway.
So, do you have any examples that come to mind? I mean, I hear this sounds like a really cool bias that I've not thought much about. But any like specific examples that you could share that would illustrate this?
Yeah, of course. I'll give you one from a study that I just recently submitted, and then one also for my own personal experience. So in a recent study, we looked at how managers respond to hedge fund activism. So hedge funds will sometimes target companies and say we don't like what you're doing, and they'll issue a campaign and try to coerce managers and directors into doing what they want. A good example of this recently, Carl Icahn didn't like the way McDonald's was treating its pigs in its supply chain, so launched this whole campaign about improving pig treatment. So that's kind of on the more obtuse end, but usually it's more performance or operational related. And most people would think, and what hedge funds expect to happen are managers just to say, okay, good idea or bad idea, and we'll push back. But what we found is that managers expect, or they think that other people expect them to demonstrate responsiveness in other ways. So we found that when there's a hedge fund campaign, these managers go way off and do totally unrelated, unnecessary activities that undermine kind of the inertia of their organizations because they believe, at least we theorize they believe, that outsiders will view them as impotent or not responding enough. So they almost overreact because of an expectation that there's no evidence exists. There's no evidence that stakeholders or investors or anybody but the hedge fund expected them to do anything. Have you heard about this with soccer goalies before? You heard about
In terms of like whether you dive left or right or stay in the middle?
Yes. Have you heard about that? The reason why they theorize that's the case?
Is it because, so if I'm remembering right, you just never want to stay in the middle. No, you never want to shoot in the middle because you don't want to look like an idiot if you miss in the middle. Is that what I'm thinking of?
This is good. It's very Dwight Schrute. I don't I think to myself, would an idiot do that thing? And if so, I do not do that thing. Which is probably another good lesson. But yeah, that's kind of it. So these Bar Eli et al. Kind of out of the University of Chicago behavioral camp, what they found is that it's most effective for a soccer goalie to basically just stand there. If a goalie doesn't move on a penalty kick, and I don't know anything about soccer, so if I get the nomenclature wrong, feel free to stop me. the probability of stopping the ball is highest, but they it's still a low probability because the net's so big. So goalies think that if they don't dive one way or another, which actually reduces the likelihood of blocking the kick, that others will think that they're idiots, that they didn't do anything. Well, how could you not have responded to that? So it's an expectation that may not even exist, right? The expectation for the coaches to block the ball. I don't care how you block it, and it's surely from the fans as well. But they think this expectation exists, so they react irrationally, even in the face of data that's now been published for 15 years or so.
Yeah, very interesting illustration. So one of the reasons I got into psychology, well, organizational psychology, is because I loved learning about these biases and the ways that our brains uh, don't always function rationally or properly. And this is a new one, John, that I am really excited to learn about. And did you mention you have a personal experience with this as well?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I think this is probably common in most professions, but certainly in academia, we have an objective metric by which we can all be judged, and that's number of publications or number of citations or publications in certain journals or whatever it is, right? Or even if it's teaching, we have an objective eval at the end. And at least I and many others with whom I spoke, have this um, perception that others expect us to have a certain number relative to other people. So we spend a lot of time comparing ourselves. Well, that person's in my cohort and they have this many publications, but I only have this many, and therefore I have to do this. And for myself, what I found that drove earlier in my career is jumping on a bunch of projects that I absolutely hated. I spent so much of my time doing the job because I thought it would increase my output more than because it was interesting and contributed to knowledge, because I had this thought where, well, people expect me to publish more papers than that person, and right now I don't have it, so I'm going to do whatever it takes to make that happen. And then it turns out that I don't think anybody had that expectation. You get your reviews from the department or your senior colleagues or whatever, and everyone's like, "You're doing great. You have too many papers. What are you doing?" And so it was a big realization, and I started to think about that in the context of my research, and I'm like, "Whoa, I am doing exactly what I research and suggest managers shouldn't do."
So, as you're thinking about combating this bias, what advice? I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is beyond the scope of what you've done so far. But if you're just, giving advice to people, how would you advise them to think about this bias and try to combat it?
Sure, three things. First, don't impute expectations from others. Listen to what has actually been said. In many careers or in many positions in your life, even if you're a student in school or something, there are pretty clear guidelines. This is what I expect of you. And of course, it's always good to try to exceed those in some ways, but not to go so far astray from the task, right? Just follow the expectations that exist, stay focused on the task at hand. Certainly, I think to remember that in some ways, and this is so universal, but if we focus on doing what we really like rather than what we think others want us to do, I think it'll kind of keep us on track.
Okay, so that just reminds me of this idea of mind reading, and I love this. Don't impute, just listen. And I think it was John Gottman, the marriage and family researcher, who's very well known, and this is one of the problems that couples get into, right, when they start trying to mind read. And so we're just better off listening than trying to mind read.
It's such a great point. I feel like I have fights in my head with my wife almost every day. Like I'm doing the dishes and I'm like, in my head I imagine myself saying like, why am I doing these dishes? I didn't make any of these. And then she's going to respond this way, and and then she's over there just watching TV, like not even thinking at all about this whole scenario I've cooked up. And I'm sure the same is. And then at the end I'm like, why did I do that? This was so irrelevant.
Well, I can certainly relate, and my poor wife can appreciate. Well, hopefully it'll be good to hear that I'm not the only one that does that. Well, such a great lesson, John. I want to be sensitive to your time. Before we wrap up, any other lessons you'd like to leave us with?
Sure, I'll give you a quick one that I think is good for society, but for us to be more introspective. I just very recently published a paper where we looked at the difference between in-group and out-group bias, basically. Right? There's historically people have kind of thought that we have a preference for others who are like ourselves and a distaste for other people who aren't like ourselves, and that those are pretty much equal, right? Like they're kind of the same thing. And what we found is that, at least in the case of politics, but it extends to other domains in life as well, is that that's not the case. People tend to, we even call it a hatred, people tend to hate others who are not like themselves more so than they look to attract people who are similar. And if you think about this with politics, people repel. They're less inclined to say, "Oh, I want to hang out with somebody with my same view," than they are to say, "I don't want to hang out with somebody who doesn't share my view." Right? And there are all sorts of reasons for this: social media and regular media, and kind of the supply of hate creating stories, and just the divisive nature of politics in general. But it's something that I try to think about all the time. I think about it even in mundane tasks, like when I'm driving. And 90% of the people out there are driving just fine. And I don't think, oh, these are my people, we're all driving fine. I focus on those few who are moving too slow or whatever. And like, I hate this person. They're saying, like, what am I focusing on? The one thing I should focus on all the good rather than that one negative.
It's like everybody that's driving slower than you is an idiot, and everybody that's driving faster is a maniac, right? As the saying
Yeah.
goes. And yeah, it is so easy to just focus on the negative. So, in your research, do you have any advice for how to try to combat this one? I mean, is it as simple as just like trying to be nice, or what have you found, or what are you thinking about?
Sure. Yeah. Trying to be nice is often easier said than done. Exposure. So we actually do theorize about this and find some cool effects that familiarity or exposure to alternative people or alternative ideas, or just others who behave different, really attenuates that distaste or that hatred effect. Even in politics, like we tend to ascribe negative attributes to people who don't agree with us. But the more we surround ourselves with those people, we're like, they're really not that different. And then so when you're confronted with others who share that view, you're more likely to accept them, is what we find. And that's consistent with the broader literature as well.
So yeah, I was just talking to Nick Epley and Juliana Schroeder, both
Mm-hmm.
on the podcast, and they were talking about how it's so easy to basically dehumanize people through text, through social media, and when you hear somebody's voice or you're in their presence, it does attenuate this fact, right? It's like, oh yeah, we're actually all people; they're not the boogeyman. Um, so we have much more in common than it's. We have much more in common than we can believe we do when we're just kind of interacting through uh, social media and the internet. Well, John, I could listen to you forever. It's like you're a professional teacher or something. I wish I could take your class. Maybe someday you'll have an online class that I can take. But I just really appreciated the chance to talk with you today and learn these lessons. And you, again, like sharing these biases. Biases is one of the reasons I got into social psychology. And I just love that I've been able to learn a few more from you today. So thanks so much, John.
Thank you, Ned. I really appreciate it.